Mr. Forrester, you'll have the last question of the evening.
Okay, it was going to be another question, but I think we want to continue this discussion about at least House Bill 1776, which I had the pleasure of reading today, again. Why is it silent? It's very, very meticulous on the revenue side. Why is it silent on what happens to the money, how it's distributed to the school districts?
The legislation you're probably looking at is the one that's available online. We have an amendment that's been drafted. That amendment was actually part of the Independent Fiscal Office review. So if you've not had a chance to review the Independent Fiscal Office study on it, I encourage you to take a look at that. It encompasses the amendment that addresses more of that issue. In the amendment language, and I'll focus on that to kind of answer your question, in the amendment we do have a funding formula that drives it out. Essentially, we look and say we're going to look at the existing level of funding that a school district is receiving through their school property taxes, and as a starting point, we're going to say that same amount of money is driven out to the school districts. So the idea is to not tie their hands and say that you're going to get less money than they would have gotten had they collected school property taxes. The challenge there, of course, is what do you do in the years that follow? As a starting point, we put in legislation, or the amendment says that will continue for year after year. My ultimate goal is to help put a funding formula in place, not just for the school property tax replacement money, but also as a general rule, the education funding formula. Right now we have a situation where, regardless of a loss of population out west, school districts are receiving the same amount of money year after year. So their populations are being cut in half by people moving out of the area, and yet we end up paying the same amount of money to them. There are representatives in western Pennsylvania, Armstrong County to be exact, they're building rock walls in an elementary school, and that cannot be inexpensive. He told me the cost of it, incidentally, but we can't allow them to continue to do that. The funding formula as a whole needs to change.
Yeah, John, thanks for the question, because I agree that one of the most significant problems with HB 1776 is the fact that they don't decide what the funding formula is. And unfortunately, for schools in Philadelphia or schools in Pittsburgh, where they have a lot of sway in Harrisburg because of the demographics of our state, that might work out just fine. But we know here in Berks County, where we have some excellent schools in the 129th. Some of them are ranked in the top 1% of the state in terms of educational outcomes. And the fact of the matter is, if we say that we're going to take the way schools are funded right now, and instead of your school board deciding on that, we're going to let Harrisburg politicians make that decision, there's no way we win in that scenario. There is no way Berks County wins in that scenario because we just don't have the leverage in Harrisburg to help get our way. So Mr. Cox is right that one of the most significant problems, of course, is the fact that we go by this old law that's called hold harmless, which essentially means old census data is what determines who gets what. So of course, in our areas here where we've grown since 1990, we can't even get that passed. So we get better funding from the state. You know, one of the significant drivers of costs, which of course it doesn't address in HB 76, there's never been any kind of legislation introduced by my opponent, are the cost drivers of schools. One of those is cyber schools, which of course is something my opponent supports. They have cost the districts in the 129th over $2 million this year alone. The second is the fact that the state used to provide, in 30 years ago, 50% of the school district's budget. So that money came from the state. Now it's all coming from the local property tax owner. The average in the 129th is 25%. So if you want to know why your property taxes are going up, look no further than Harrisburg politicians that are making those decisions.
Response?
There's a lot covered there, and I'll just cut to the chase. School districts are like a teenager that parents say, hey, I'm going to pay for your lunch today or pay for your dinner. And so the child goes out and he goes to McDonald's and it costs him $10 to eat. The parent says, I'll pay half. What's happened in our school district is the same thing that is going to happen as it happened in what I'm going to describe here. After a few years, the child says, you know what, I'm getting sick of McDonald's. I'm going to go to, say, Olive Garden. And he decides he's going to spend a little bit more. So he spends $15, comes back to mom and dad and says, I'm spending more, but you need to give me half. It continues on and on for years. And what's happened in our school districts, for every dollar that we give to school districts from the state funding, and that state funding comes from each of you, there is no government money. For every dollar that we give to the school districts, they have increased property taxes at the tune of $1.33. They are outpacing us in what they are costing. Their taste is getting that much more expensive, and they're asking us to keep up with it rather than reining in how they're spending.
Of course, part of the problem is that big government daddy Harrisburg is the one telling the school districts that they have to go to Olive Garden. They're the ones driving the kids' decision where they're going to go eat. Because the fact of the matter is, special education funding, any school district will tell you special education funding has dug in to their budgets, and rightfully so, because we're doing a better job at this. But of course, the state, which funds special education, has continually diminished the amount they pay. Those are what we call unfunded mandates, that the state and the federal government say to schools, you have to do this, but we're not going to pay for it. So they're the ones telling the kids, which I guess in this case is the school board, to go to Olive Garden, but they're only giving them the McDonald's money. And that's a problem. So one of those two things have to change. Either the state can help come up with savings, changing, for example, the cyber school formula would be a great first step in that regard, or at least providing more funding for special education, or maybe some other ways to consolidate savings, none of which have been solutions that have come from my opponent in his 6 years in office.
Thank you to our panelists for excellent questions, and that was a very good, healthy back and forth between our candidates.